Good evening, Town Meeting. It's my pleasure to present to you tonight this citizens article that is the next step in a long process to address housing affordability in Lexington. Please note that the views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily represent those of my constituents in Precinct 2, nor the views of any committees on which I may serve. In 2020 and 2021, Town Meeting overwhelmingly supported two articles designed to mitigate the impact of new development in Lexington on our housing inventory. The passage of those articles resulted in petitions to the state legislature for special action to enact specialized fees and implement the articles. Those fees are what is called a linkage fee, which I will detail later in the presentation. If approved, this article would appropriate $75,000 to pay for consulting services to produce two Nexus studies, which is what will be required for the town to implement the special legislation. And the motion is structured so that the funds would only be expended if the special legislation is approved and signed by the governor. Before getting into the details of what a Nexus study is, I wanted to briefly remind Town Meeting about the two enabling articles that are now bills pending in the legislature. The first is Special Town Meeting 2020-2, Article 6, which is now House Bill 4314. This article focused on establishing the link between residential development and the impact on housing supply and demand, and how to mitigate those impacts via a linkage fee. The Home Rule petition was filed 13 months ago and was ultimately referred to the Joint Committee on Municipalities and Regional Government. There was a hearing in January that I, Representative Socolo, and others from the town testified at, and the committee is now expected to report out on it any day now. The second article was Annual Town Meeting 2021's Article 36, which is now House Bill 3891. This article focused on establishing the link between commercial development and the impact on housing supply and demand, and how to mitigate those impacts via a linkage fee. The Home Rule petition was filed 10 months ago and was referred to the Joint Committee on Housing. There was a hearing in November that I and Representative Socolo testified at, and the committee reported out favorably on the bill last month, moving one step closer to approval. In order to implement new fees resulting from this legislation, the Select Board needs to know what are reasonable fee ranges that will provide critical housing mitigation while not restricting development. And the way to guide the board's decision-making is through a Nexus study. Nexus studies are used to characterize the linkage between new development and its impact on housing demand and needs, and is a rigorous data-driven process which defines an impact mitigation fee that is tailored to local trends and conditions. The underpinning of linkage fees were established by two Supreme Court cases that set the legal standard that there must be a quote-unquote rational nexus between the purpose of the mitigation fee and the development activity, and that the amount of the mitigation must be proportional to that activity. The need for a defined rational nexus is why these are called Nexus studies. To give an example of what the Nexus study will do, I will briefly walk through the study process for a commercial development linkage fee. First, the economic development trends are assessed and a projection of future economic development is estimated. This includes looking at the sectors of commercial growth for a particular geographic area, what industries that growth will be in, and how many jobs might be created. For example, how many new hospitality, manufacturing, or professional services jobs. These trends are also compared against neighboring peer communities. Next, the real estate market is assessed, including the amount and availability of rental and ownership properties and the income levels needed to afford housing. Then an estimate is made of how many of those individuals taking the new jobs from commercial development will want to live where they work. With these two components, an estimate is made of how new commercial development will impact the supply and demand for housing, and if shortfalls are created in specific housing categories, such as low and moderate income community housing, and how much money would be required to produce new units to meet the demand. From the number of units required, the construction costs are estimated and the affordability gap of the tenants is added in, along with federal and state incentive programs, and a financing gap is determined. Then a dollar per square foot linkage fee is calculated to determine the full mitigation amount to address this financing gap. The linkage fee rate is then compared to peer communities looking to attract the same businesses, such as life sciences companies, and a competitiveness assessment is performed. Based on the assessment, the full fee amount is reduced to a candidate range rate that will ensure the municipality with the fee remains competitive against peer communities that may or may not have a like fee. The adjusted rate is what municipal decision makers use as the basis for implementing a linkage fee. That was a lot of information, so let's walk through a specific example. In 2017, Somerville undertook a Nexus study to adjust their existing commercial linkage fee. They found that over the next 10 years, they would expect 2.21 million square feet of new commercial development, which would result in around 8,900 new jobs. Of those who would take those jobs and would want to work and live in Somerville, 591 new affordable housing units would be needed to mitigate the increased demand for housing. After incentive programs and other funding was taken into account, a $162 million funding gap was left, which would result in a hypothetical $86 per square foot commercial linkage fee. At the time, $86 would have been 17 times Somerville's current linkage fee and more than 6 times that of Cambridge. And after a thorough analysis on competitiveness was performed, an $8 to $10 per square foot fee was determined that would keep Somerville competitive against peer communities while providing an important fraction of the housing mitigation required. This is the process by which balance is achieved between mitigating part of the impact of new development while not restricting commercial growth. I often get asked about how does what is being proposed under this article fit within a larger picture, and I'd like to share with you some continued thoughts on a roadmap for housing mitigation. It started with the passage of the 2 linkage fee articles at town meeting and their filing with the legislature. Given that one bill has already been reported out as favorable, there is a good likelihood it will be enacted later this summer, and the next step is to perform the Nexus study that will inform the rate setting by the Select Board. If Article 26 is approved tonight, when one or both pieces of special legislation are enacted, the town can release requests for proposals and begin to move out on producing the Nexus studies. And sometime later, the Select Board can deliberate on the study findings and set initial linkage fee rates. At the same time, the town is working on getting better at producing community housing by looking at establishing a housing trust and a housing development corporation. This means that if new linkage fees are enacted, the town will have a much more efficient and effective process for developing housing with those revenues. That said, while this is a long-term approach, we have to make continual progress, and the next step in that process is the funding of these studies through the appropriation requested this evening. There are also additional benefits to having these studies in hand. At this town meeting, we will hear 2 proposals for rezoning under the planned development rezoning process. It has been the trend in recent years for the town to seek additional concessions as part of these rezoning proposals through the Memorandum of Understanding process, and sometimes those can include housing mitigation payments. The issue is, how does the town manager's office know what to request in terms of reasonable mitigation payments from each proposal in each situation? For example, the developer who will be before us later this town meeting to request a rezoning of 475 Bedford Street into a life sciences building has also developed life sciences properties in Somerville. Somerville has had a housing linkage fee in place for decades and currently requires $10 per square foot in mitigation payments. An example is shown on the left for a property from the same developer with 1.2 million square feet, which would result in an estimated $1.17 million in housing mitigation payments. Compare that to the 180,000 square foot development being proposed at 475 Bedford Street, which, given the amount of housing mitigation being discussed in the Memorandum of Understanding as of the date of this presentation, would amount to $1.76 per square foot in mitigation. How was this number arrived at? What is Lexington's true housing mitigation rate, and how does $1.76 per square foot compare? These Nexus studies would go a long way to making sure the town is requesting appropriate mitigation from landowners who are seeking rezoning and whose developments will create more pressure on Lexington's housing. In closing, this article seeks $75,000 to fund 2 studies, and the study costs were determined through discussions with professionals who produce such studies. Funds will only be expended in accordance with the passage of corresponding enabling special legislation later this summer, and the study's findings will have multiple benefits for town decision-making and policy development. Thank you for your time, and I hope you will support this article.